Hello and welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a genuinely hilarious, yet surprisingly philosophical dialogue today about something a lot of us secretly struggle with, actually sitting down to read a book. We've got two characters here. One is an avid, super enthusiastic reader, and the other is Hankman. And Hankman is, frankly, the ultimate non-reader. As we unpack their back and forth, we're going to hit on some really profound ideas about the psychology of modern communication, the hidden costs of our media diets, and, well, where the creative spark actually comes from. So let's just get right into it. Right off the bat, this dialogue hits us with a question that sounds super simple but is actually incredibly loaded. What makes a book worth reading? The avid reader in our story is totally baffled by Hankman's whole anti-reading vibe. He asks, is it really that hard to grasp that people still read books? And Hankman's response is just brilliant, because he doesn't trash the idea of reading. Instead, he admits he often wonders what kind of book he should read, but his mind just goes completely blank. It sets up the big mystery of our explainer. What exactly does it take to make the massive commitment of reading actually worth your time? Which brings us to Hankman's core dilemma, totally nailed in this quote. Maybe there just isn't a book made for me. Man, have you ever felt that way? Just staring blankly at a massive library shelf or scrolling endlessly through a digital storefront, feeling completely overwhelmed, and finally deciding, you know what, none of this fits my exact mood right now. Hankman is dealing with the universal friction of choice. It's not that he hates books, it's more like he thinks his personal bar for engagement is so wildly specific that literally no existing piece of literature can clear it. Section 1. The Reluctant Reader. Finding the right fit. Okay, so the reader pushes Hankman a bit. He asks, what would a book have to be like for you to actually enjoy it? And Hankman's immediate deadpan reply is just perfect. He says, probably short. It's a really funny moment in the text, but honestly, it's deeply revealing. Before we even talk about genre or plot or character arcs, Hankman's absolute first line of defense is time management. His ideal book just needs to end quickly. But as we're going to see, this demand for brevity is really just a symptom of a much deeper anxiety he has about the whole act of reading. Section 2. The Cost of Reading. The Communication Dilemma. And this brings us to the central conflict of the whole dialogue. It's like a philosophical ping-pong match. The avid reader argues that the entire point of a book is just diving into another world for a while. You know, immersion, escapism, pure joy. But Hankman? He looks at the exact same activity through a totally inverted lens. For him, the issue isn't the book itself. It's this overwhelming feeling of being cut off from the real world. Where the reader sees a magical door opening up to a new universe, Hankman just sees a door slamming shut on reality. To him, reading is basically an act of total isolation. To back up this intense fear of isolation, Hankman drops this bizarre yet strictly logical thought experiment, the desert island scenario. He tells his buddy that if he were stranded on a deserted island, he'd be absolutely thrilled to have any book, no matter how awful it was. Why? Because on a deserted island, his baseline level of external communication is literally zero. In that one highly specific scenario, reading a book bumps his communication level up from talking to himself to something at least a little higher. He treats human interaction like a strict economy. For him, reading only gains value when the real-world communication market has completely tanked. Well, the avid reader immediately points out the flaw in that logic. Hankman thinks a book actively lowers his current communication level. But wait, what about the quality of the book? A literary masterpiece has got to be better than just idle chit-chat, right? But Hankman sets this impossibly high bar. He says, maybe there simply isn't a book for me that can compensate for the loss of communication through its quality. What's fascinating here is how he frames reading as an act of sacrifice. A book isn't just competing against a movie or a TV show. It's actively trying to outcompete the dynamic, high-level communication of the living, breathing world. And in Hankman's mind, no author on earth is good enough to win that fight. So the avid reader kind of sighs and says, I think it's more that reading involves a certain amount of effort. And Hankman just instantly weaponizes that point to lock in his ultimate reading equation. Step 1, reading restricts communication. Step 2, it requires effort. The result? Hankman joyfully concludes, now I've got it. I just need a long vacation on a deserted island. I mean, he has completely rationalized his absolute refusal to pick up a book. By doing this mental math to prove reading is a net negative in modern society, he totally frees himself from the guilt of not being a reader. Section 3, the robot test, designing the perfect book. So his friend plays along and asks what book he'd actually take to this theoretical island. And Hankman's erstwhile is incredibly ironic. He says, definitely not a book with people in it who read books. Just think about how funny that is. His aversion to reading is so strong, he absolutely refuses to even spend time with imaginary characters who enjoy the hobby. He wants his fictional escape to be 100% devoid of literature. Which leads to this wildly absurd logical leap. Hankman declares his ideal cast of characters, preferably a book with robots. They don't read books at all, at most instruction manuals. Since human characters might secretly be bookworms, the only safe bet for him is artificial intelligence. Robots are the ultimate protagonists for Hankman specifically because they share his utter disdain for leisurely reading. They only consume information for pure, strict utility, like a user manual. The avid reader, totally recognizing how ridiculous this conversation has gotten, decides to just roll with it and reverse engineer Hankman's logic. If we follow this train of thought all the way to the station, we basically get a brand new definition. A robot is simply someone who exclusively reads instruction manuals. It's this perfectly sound philosophical theorem that was born entirely out of pure laziness. Hankman absolutely loves this. He calls it a reliable clue for identifying robots. What started off as this flimsy excuse for why a guy doesn't want to crack open a paperback has accidentally spawned a genuinely brilliant, highly usable sci-fi concept. Just imagine a dystopian world where the Turing test isn't about asking complex emotional questions, but just checking to see if someone reads a novel or if they exclusively read their microwave's operating manual. It's a fantastic idea, and it was born completely out of a desire to avoid reading. Section 4. Becoming the author, the creative twist. Okay. So the avid reader, realizing that Hankman just effortlessly brainstormed this totally unique, funny, and compelling sci-fi premise, points out the obvious. He tells Hankman he should actually write a book about it, totally assuring him it'd be a massive hit. Hankman is super skeptical at first, but then his friend delivers the narrative climax of the whole source text. You're just not much of a reader. You're more of a writer. And wow, there's the big epiphany. All of Hankman's friction, his hypercritical take on communication, his inability to find a book that perfectly fits his vibe, none of that was a defect. It was just misdirected creative energy. Hankman's reaction is instantaneous. The guy who was practically paralyzed by the thought of consuming a book suddenly says, "Why are you only telling me this now? I'm getting to work immediately." We get to witness this hilarious total transformation. He flips from being a fiercely reluctant reader, complaining about the effort and isolation of books, straight into an incredibly eager creator. The very act of tearing down the concept of reading handed him the exact inspiration he needed to start writing. So, the really crucial takeaway here is how this dialogue compares the passive struggle of consuming media with the active solution of creating it. On one hand, we've got reading, which, for someone like Hankman, is this frustrating, exhausting search for a book that perfectly aligns with his specific neuroses and sky-high demands. But on the other hand, we have writing, that's taking control and actively creating that exact highly specific book yourself. It perfectly illuminates the core irony of the source text. Sometimes being overly critical of art just means you're actually the one meant to be making it. And that leaves us with a final, slightly provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. Does a reluctance to consume art actually fuel the desire to create it? Maybe the people who are the absolute hardest to please as an audience are actually the ones holding the most unique stories in their own heads. So, the next time you find yourself staring at a screen or a bookshelf, totally unable to find exactly what you want, ask yourself, are you really just a reluctant reader, or are you actually a writer just waiting to get to work? Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through such a brilliant dialogue. I hope this explainer sparks some curiosity and, hey, maybe even a little creative inspiration for you today.